When the billionaire walked through his gates earlier than expected, he never imagined that one moment would shatter his trust forever. He had returned, eager to surprise the two women he cherished most, his aging mother and his little daughter. But instead of joy, his heart froze as he saw the unthinkable. The woman he was about to marry, the one he believed was filled with love and grace, stood with a bucket in her hands. And with a cruel smirk, she poured filthy, dirty water over the very people he held closest to his soul. In that instant, the fairy tale of love turned into a nightmare of betrayal. The question was no longer would he marry her, but what would he do after witnessing the truth with his own eyes. The billionaire had always believed in timing, in control, in the ability to plan every detail of his life. That morning, however, something within him pushed him to return home earlier than scheduled. He thought it would be a small surprise, a chance to see his mother and his little girl smile as he walked through the gates ahead of time. The car slowed at the mansion's driveway, and with quiet steps he moved inside, his heart light with anticipation. He imagined his daughter running into his arms, his mother's gentle blessing on his forehead, and perhaps even his fiancée waiting with a warm embrace. But the scene that unfolded before him was nothing short of shattering. There, in the courtyard, stood the woman he thought he loved. She was dressed in elegance as always, her beauty sharpened by the cruel curve of her lips. In her hands, she clutched a bucket filled with murky, dirty water. His mother, fragile with age but still dignified, was seated on a chair with his little girl clinging to her side. They looked up at the fiancé, confusion and fear mixing in their eyes, as if unable to understand why someone they had welcomed into their lives would treat them this way. The billionaire's chest tightened as he froze in the shadows, watching. Without hesitation, the fiancé tilted the bucket and poured its filthy contents over them. His daughter shrieked, a sound that pierced through the air like a dagger. His mother gasped, shivering under the shock of the cold and the humiliation. And all the while, his fiancée's laughter rang out, low and scornful, as if their suffering brought her satisfaction. For a moment, the billionaire could not breathe. His world, once so carefully built, seemed to fracture around him. This was the woman he had chosen to bring into his home, the one he thought would nurture his daughter and respect his mother. Every second felt like a storm inside his chest. Anger, betrayal, disbelief, and sorrow clashed until he could no longer remain a silent witness. He stepped forward, his shoes echoing against the marble floor. His fiancée turned, startled, the blood draining from her face as she realized he had seen everything. Her eyes widened, and the cruel smile faltered into panic. The bucket clattered to the ground, but the damage was already done. His mother sat trembling, trying to comfort the child, while his daughter's innocent eyes filled with tears as she stared at him, silently begging for protection. The billionaire's gaze hardened, and in that instant, she knew the mask she had worn for so long had slipped beyond repair. No amount of excuses or honeyed words could erase what he had witnessed with his own eyes. His heart ached for his mother's pain and his daughter's fear, but beneath the ache burned a rising flame of resolve. The fiancé, once so carefully adored, was now exposed as nothing more than a heartless intruder who had dared to harm the only people he could never live without. And as silence settled heavily around them, the course of all their lives shifted forever. The moment the fiancé's mask slipped, her world began to crumble. She had built her relationship with the billionaire on carefully crafted lies, sweet smiles, and empty promises. But the truth, ugly and undeniable, now stood in the open air. He stared at her with eyes that no longer carried love, only a deep and burning disappointment that pierced her more than any shouted words could. She stammered, reaching out with trembling hands, trying to weave together excuses, but her voice cracked under the weight of her guilt. His mother and daughter, still wet from the cruel act, clung to one another, their trembling bodies silently testifying against her. The little girl's sobs echoed like fragile bells, each one striking him with the painful realization of how blind he had been. He stepped closer, his footsteps slow yet unyielding, and the fiancé's breath hitched as if every movement brought her closer to her end. The man who once showered her with gifts and admiration now stood tall like a storm, his presence overwhelming, his silence more terrifying than any anger. She tried to speak, to twist the story, to paint his mother and daughter as the cause of her cruelty, but the words sounded hollow, empty lies floating in the heavy air. He didn't answer. He only looked at his child, lifted her gently into his arms, and brushed his mother's shoulder as if to assure them both that their dignity would not remain stained by this betrayal. The fiancée panicked, dropping to her knees, pleading for forgiveness, her voice rising in desperation. She swore it was a mistake, a lapse of judgment, a moment of madness that would never repeat. But the billionaire knew better. He had spent years in business, studying faces, listening for truth beneath polished words. And what he saw now was not a slip, not a mistake, but the raw, cruel nature she had kept hidden until she thought his trust was too strong to be broken. He realized that if he had arrived home even an hour later, this side of her might have stayed hidden for months, maybe years, until the damage to his family became permanent. He turned away from her pleas, his heart heavy but resolute. The life he had envisioned with her, wedding vows, shared mornings, and a home filled with laughter, dissolved like smoke before his eyes. What remained was the clarity of truth, a painful gift that saved him before it was too late. His daughter tightened her arms around his neck, her tears soaking his collar, and in that embrace he found his answer. He would never allow anyone to harm them again. His mother, though shaken, lifted her chin with quiet strength, her dignity unbroken despite the cruelty she had endured. As the fiancé's cries turned to screams, begging him to stay, he walked past her, each step severing the ties that had once bound them. The gates of the mansion closed behind him with a finality that echoed in her heart. Inside, the man she thought she had conquered no longer belonged to her. His love had been replaced by resolve, his trust by clarity, and his silence by the promise of justice. What she had poured over his family was not just dirty water, it was the end of everything she thought she had secured.